Namaskar. It's indeed been a privilege to be speaking over here today evening, uh, and that too in a structure which Gandhi lived here and carried on his roller satyagraha. I feel his presence every time I come to Mani Bhavan, and I feel privileged to be talking over here. I am going to talk on cultural strategies in the making of Indian nation. Here, two things I would like to make it very clear. One, what is the culture? I only would like to give the culture as the definition of culture as given by Claude Levi-Strauss. He said it's a cultural, structural approach to culture. He says culture as interrelated parts that form an overarching structure. Levi-Strauss believed that common cultural have their roots in their basic structures of mind. Patterns of human thought produce the cultural categories that organize our worldviews. It is within the structure of what it means by culture, as given by Clifford Gies and Jack Barzoon, the two celebrated professors at the Columbia University, and the one, Jack Barzoon, died in 2012 at the age of 104. He, as cultural historians and cultural anthropologists, what they conceptualized of culture as a collection of symbols, signs, and symbolic rites that have specific meanings. All interpretation must necessarily be rooted in a particular moment. They apply to a specific time, context, and situation. It requires careful observation about the meaning of their symbols and symbolic action. Now, this is exactly what I am going to talk about, the culture that was used in so many articles that I wrote on Marathi theatre and law of sedition, 19th century. I realized that British conquest was not just an economic and political conquest, it was a cultural conquest. And soon the Indian intellectuals also realized that it is not within the structure of what the Britishers provided that they got to fight for, or they got to counter the cultural onslaught, but that has to be within the Indian cultural norms and Indian cultural roots. And this is what I have used the phrase in the making of Indian nation in my title. I use this as what was used by Surnath Banerjee, born 1848, died in 1925. He wrote his autobiography, is a making of a nation. And therefore, I felt that how they used right from the early 19th century till the Gandhian phase, the end of Gandhian phase, how their entire thought process was rooted in the Indian culture and how they countered the British onslaught, cultural onslaught. That is what is. And besides, when I say nation, as Benedict Anderson said, it's even an imagined community. It's an imagined community. My father would always ask me. Father was born in 1908, and he once asked me when I became lecturer and started lecturing in Mumbai University. He said, "Your India, for 41 years of my life my India was different than your India. I was born in post-independent India." And he said, my India included Pakistan, Sindh. I had been to Sindh 4 times. It was like this. So it's an imagined community, what we think of today. And how that whole concept, people today talk of many Indias. People today talk of number of other things. There is cultural diversity, but there is something that binds together. It is not, as the British historians have said, that it is the British rule that bound the Indians together, but the Indians were bound together, welded into one force not just by what as a counter to the British, and that's what was their argument, that once India would become independent, it will collapse because they are different nations. It has not collapsed for 76 years, and it is not going to collapse anymore. So this is, the idea of India, the phrase idea of India was first used by Rabindranath Tagore, Rabindranath Tagore. And there are a number of others who have written on Indian nationalism. Bipin Chandra Pal, so also Aurobindo Ghosh, they have written. And I felt that the concept of Indian nation evolved over a period of time of what India is today. And in this, a few things I want to make very clear is that the first two places where the British rule began, first was in Bengal from 1757 onwards, and then in Maharashtra. When I say Maharashtra, it is not just Marathi speaking. It includes Gujaratis, includes Bhatiyas, it includes Marathi Muslims, it includes everyone. So, but the basis is the Maharashtra as a territory, I would rather say. And it was in Maharashtra, it became only with the fall of Peshwa government in 1818. But the reaction to the British rule depended on the degree of exposure both these places had. The first, Bengal had its exposure from 1757 onwards, whereas Maharashtra had it in 1818. But an important distinction between the two is that in Bengal, there was considerable different influence of the British rule, which led, because of the Cornwallis' permanent settlement, a class of Badrlok, and it replaced the Nawab's government. The actual administration of Britishers got only with the Regulating Act and the Pitt's India Act. They had to govern, and this was extremely important factor, which I'll come little later. Otherwise there was no actual government, and the first 50 years of British rule consisted of brazen, brute, attitude of the British soldiers and others towards because they collected money without any responsibility. And then the Marathas lost Maharashtra, they lost their power in 1818. They had their own government, and therefore, like the British had rule in Bengal, Bengal had a Bhadralok that emerged with the landed aristocracy that emerged, which did not take place in Maharashtra. And also a kind of a Darosian movement that developed. It did not develop in Maharashtra. So for Maharashtrian intellectuals, right from Balasahib Jambekar onwards, it was only a loss of power. It was a loss of power, and they did not accept anything by way of accepting British culture as the basis. So they accepted the progressive ideas that came through the medium of English language. English language, they said, is different, and British rule is different. So they accepted, and they also questioned. They say it is wrong to say that the Britishers introduced Western education. That leads me to question, what is West? Is it a homogeneous one entity that should be termed as West? It's like the phrase that is used by Dipesh Chakravarti, provincialization of Europe. I would like to use the same phrase here. Did it mean that all Europe, entire Europe, for we Indians, particularly the Kalus, for us only Gora Sahib was our master, and we did not distinguish between the British, Irish, or the Scottish, or the French, or anybody. For us, every Gora Sahib man was a master, and that is why the European definition of the British white man subject, even in Indian Penal Code and before, was European British subject, a person belonging to European extraction. It's a racist definition that was So it is a very different thing. What the Maharashtrian intellectual accepted was they were the basic, say, progressive ideas that came through the medium of English. They accepted the progressive ideas, but they did not accept British rule. Very few accept Lokhidwadi, called it divine dispensation. But by and large, nobody accepted it. By and large, I said, nobody accepted it as divine dispensation. And there was a kind of a love and hate relationship. A love and hate relationship. They admired the Englishman for his progressive ideas. They accepted the liberal ideas. Not only they started New English education, people like Agarkar, Chiplankar and others, they started New English education, but they did not accept British rule. They felt that it is only, to lie low for a while until you regain your vitality to fight back. And therefore, a person like Gokhale, who would go to England, who went to England and first said, I want to meet my college de hero, who was Secretary of State, William Morley. So they admired the British, their progressive European ideas, and all ideas were not British. In India, the British did not introduce French Revolution in syllabus right until 1916. Right, 1916. What they described in 1855, where the syllabus was framed in all three universities, was of the reflections on the revolution in France by Edmund Burke, which condemned French Revolution. Their object of projecting was the bloodless revolution of 1688, but not the French Revolution, mind you. Now, this is very important, I believe. This is very important. It is not that Western, the British rarely introduced education. They took up education in 1839. In 1839, almost all lower caste people were removed in Bombay from schools, boys, because they said, if the lower caste people would come for education, the higher caste people will not be funding their education. The British did not want to spend any amount on that. And that then comes the theory of that, they say, downward filtration theory. You teach the upper caste, it will filter down to the lower. But they refused to accept it. And Dadoba Pandurang was removed from that school, and the Pantoji of that government school said, Dadya, shikshan gene हे तुमच्या वैश्याचं काम नाही आहे. So that's where the British were very, even in 1854, what everybody they called as great, Magna Carta of Indian education. It's the British who called, and that's what they said. The British will not introduce any institutions of education. They will, if the natives bring these educational institutions, they will only give grant in aid. So the onus of starting everything was on Indians to start. So it is wrongly projected before us, and I would also. This is exactly why the Indian intellectuals realized what they exactly meant by, Western education or anything. I really felt the revolt was a very, earlier they projected, there is a concept of Orientalism right from William Jones onwards, right? H.T. Colebrook, they wrote on Upanishads as well as many of these scriptures. And William Jones wrote on Manusmriti. The first thing that the British, this is one point, and then I would go to other things. This is the first thing that the British, when they took the administration after Pitt's India Act, was they were absolutely at sea to know what was Hindu law. What was Hindu, because they had to know what was partition, Hindu succession, and many civil laws. They felt that one has to know the local traditions, because their idea of jurisprudence of all civil law depended on Roman pandects, Justice of Justinian, and on which the European law is based. And they felt that similarly a digest should be created Because once a fellow comes from Haileybury, or even all these fellows right up to 1857, please remember, all of them, they have come to India by nomination. And they came between the age of 15 and 17. There are categories. They came as cadets. Elphinstone came at the age of 16. Mount Stuart Elphinstone. John Malcolm came at the age of 17. They had to come only, not even 18. Not even 18. And they were nominated by the members of the board of directors in East India Company. They had to be nominations. And they came as cadets. They came as writers. Therefore, in Calcutta, you have a writers' building. Writers and surgeons, assistant surgeons. They were little of different age. But these writers and cadets came at the age between 15 and 17. That was mandatory. Nobody would come even at age of 18. So when they came here at the age of 15 and 17, they were brute. They did not know anything Sanskrit. They believed something what existed in England would be also in India. So they were confronted with Hindu law. And therefore, there was no love for Indian culture. It was necessity that brought them to study Hindu law. And finally, what they did, I don't have so much of time with me, so I would not like to go into the details, on which I am fully writing a paper on how evolution of Hindu law. And I realized there that they brought Manusmriti. See, it was in Bengal, it was Dayabag. In Maharashtra, it was Vyavhar Mayuk and Mitakshara. That was the law. And it was much more local traditions. There were local traditions. Together, that became Elphinstone's Code Napoleon, Code Elphinstone in 1827. So in Bengal was different. This one, there were different traditions. And these traditions were in Benares. So that is why, right till 1864, they had to have a munshi, a Muslim Amin, as well as a Pandit attached to every court to interpret the Shastras. And that is why they needed many of these Shastris. They never trusted Shastris because Shastris never spoke in unison. And therefore, they always suspected the Shastris. They expected that they were duping them. That was what was the idea of that. And the European scholars tried to make one Hindu digest. Because a fellow comes from Haileybury College. In Haileybury, the Hindu law was taught. Hindu law in England, it was taught. Something of what Manusmriti was. Colebrook was also a lecturer there who went to England in 1823. So they were, and he comes to India. He does not know, has not even heard the name of Thane. Suddenly hears the name that he is posted in Thane. He does not know anything, fellow does not know anything of what becomes ICS. So they wanted to give him the digest called Hindu law. He would read it for 15 days. He sits there as the judge. Right? He does not know anything about Indian. And their knowledge was so desultory of Hindu law. So they needed a Shastri. They needed a Muslim man, Qazi, attached to the court. So everything had it like this, 1864. After the Indian Penal Code and Indian IPC and both criminal procedure were codified, they became this. Now this is what it meant. They also started some of the colleges. They started Calcutta Hindu College, Sanskrit College. That was in 1st January 24. They started a similar college in Banaras. That was started by the one who became governor in Bombay, Jonathan Duncan, who was one together with Mackintosh, started in Literary Society of Bombay, which became Asiatic Society. That was in Pune. It was started in 1823. In Banaras, it was started in 1789, 1791. Now, that was to provide the Shastris to the court. That was what was the, and they had their local traditions. They had their local traditions. But the most important factor that was responsible, and which the Britishers, because when we talk about our culture, why Macaulay becomes very important. Prior to that, Macaulay's minutes of 1835, what happened was very important. Printing began in printing press began in Calcutta first, and then in Bombay. Bombay Samachar became the oldest of that. But what is most important, the important contribution of printing, is that as the printing evolved, as the technology evolved, and more newspapers became, both in Gujarati, Marathi, and Bengali, it brought the word of the Shastris down. Because the printed word started spreading to the people much more faster than what the Shastris through their sermons and pravachans and everything would give. And they brought, so the word, even in Europe, same thing happened. It is undermined the dominance of the church and the parish when the printing of press. But what was most important, that press was liberated by Marquess of Hastings. And in 1823, they deported many people, not just Indians, but most of the press in Europe, in India, in Bengal, was in the hands of the Europeans, even in Bombay. But what was worse was any person who questioned on Queen, on East India Company, anything on the military in India, on the East India Company's administration in India, any European, they had to come here and have license, but they were deported without trial. And one of the most important person who was deported in 1823 was James Silk Buckingham. And then they came with many restrictions under John Adams, who was acting Governor General. And John Adams was a cousin of Mountstuart Elphinstone. He was his first cousin. And they did not accept. When I was going through the exact terminologies they used in the restrictions, that is exactly what Section 124A in 1870 they introduced in sedition. Right? The terminology is same. And they borrowed it, and that's where, when that particular, those restrictions which he promulgated, John Adams, were not accepted by Edward West in the judges in Bombay. There is also a difference was to understand. There were two things: East India Company's officials and crown appointed judges. They are two different things. All West and others were crown appointed judges. The East India Company had no control over them. And their job was to keep a watch on the brute administrators of like Elphinstone and others in Calcutta and in Bombay and in Madras. So some of the judges who were appointed by the crown went by, because hand in glove with the rulers here. But some like Edward West did not do it. Edward West, they did not do. So there was always a conflict between judges and the East India Company officials. The East India Company officials were the one who came at 15 and 17. In years of experience, they came up as governors and other things, the collectors and others. Here, and until the Haileybury College people came as collectors, ICS people, that was after 1836. And that's exactly why the need to have Hindu law, the money that was spent on all the Shastris and their education, that's exactly what was termed as Orientalist Anglicist controversy. Against that expenditure, which was not done from 1813 to 33, the missionaries for the first time in Charter 33 were allowed. So Macaulay comes against that background. And that Macaulay came as a law member under the Charter Act of 1833 because he was one who formed the first law commission. And that's where he introduced, and then his close person to James Mill and Bentham, as Macaulay was. So he comes with how to have an Indian, Indian in blood and color, and British in thought and opinion. The whole sentence everybody knows how Macaulay, that became basis for that. And Macaulay being close to James Mill. James Mill worked in East India Company's office. James and his son John Stuart Mill also worked in East India Company's office. And James Mill, John Mill, his son, John Stuart Mill, his son, they wrote on all minutes on education from East India Company's office. And later on, when the Crown took over the government, the defense of East India Company was entirely written by John Stuart Mill. But that is a different thing. So people came up with James Mill's book of 1819, which was absolutely casting aspersions on Indian character, and wherein he makes a mention that the Hindu is like a eunuch and excels in the qualities of a slave. He made without coming to India. It is to that book many reacted. And where does the cultural difference come? If you take the Maharashtrian intellectuals, you see the first people in Bengal, something like the attack also came of the missionaries, Serampore missionaries. They had to first counter that attack. Also, look after the evils that had to be remedied. And Rajaram Mohan Roy finds the middle path of that. Many of the Christians, and he was a student of comparative religions. In 1804, he wrote Tuftul Muawadin, and in which he wrote the first most important startling proposition: falsehood is common to all religions without distinction. When he had not studied English. So that comes, Rajaram Mohan Roy's contribution is something, and the more I am coming to know about it, the contemporary newspapers which I read in the Corona period, I have started admiring Rajaram Mohan Roy much more. Lynn Histopil has written a book called Rajaram Mohan Roy and the Victorian Britain, and in which whom he met in England, and everything is fantastic, but he stood ground. He translated, he wrote on Upanishads. He finds a middle path. But in Maharashtra, Balshastri Zambekar was the first person to translate Elphinstone's book on history of India, not Mills. Elphinstone wrote History of India after going back from over here. And he was the first person, European administrator, to call Marathas a nation. He says something, it's not nation, but something akin to nation, was started by Shivaji and the Marathas. So there is, they had their own sovereignty, they had their own government up to 1818, and it is Balshastri Zambekar first, and then Vishwanath Narayan Mandlik. They translate into Marathi Hindustanchi Bakhar, which was written by Elphinstone, not James Mill. In fact, in 1843, my senior, Professor J.V. Naik, wrote an article on Bhaskar Tarkhadkar, one who attacked James Mill in 1843. For the Maharashtrian intellectuals here, it was only to lie low until you regain your strength. But they never accepted British cultural system. they accepted the progressive British ideas, like British that came through the medium of English language. They called it Waginiche Dudh, milk the tigress. But they also named their school as New English School later on, but they hated British school. And this is where they first thing is I raised a question what it means by say concept of West. Concept of West. West, Rajaram Mohan Roy went to he landed at Marseille, took the soil, put it on his head. It's a land of liberty, equality, and fraternity. They admired French Revolution. Bhavan's book in 1842, Frenchanche Band, like 25 installments were serialized. One of the opponents of Bhavan wrote why Bhavan is spending so much of space and paper on Frenchanche Band. And then the reply given by Bhavan is that the Jnana Sindhukar thinks Frenchanche Band very similar to that of Umaji Naik's Band. Huh? They will not understand anything what is French Revolution, and therefore Jnana Sindhu hereafter be called Ajnana Sindhu. So this was the idea, and in 1842 he attacked the greatest disservice that James Mill has done to this country is he has falsified our history. Now that realization that history is being falsified comes much first over here. Same book of Elphinstone is translated into Marathi by Mandlik, Vishwanath Narayan Mandlik in 1861. So that concept of history and this always remained. And it's not just about history. One of the first books that came to for Calcutta and Bombay, and which was widely read and which influenced the people, was Thomas Paine's Age of Reason. Thomas Paine's Age of Reason, his biographer of Derozio writes in 1876, he writes that it was first sold in Calcutta market for $1 rupee, Age of Reason. And the demand became so much that the rate was raised to 5 rupees. Now 5 rupees was a huge amount that time in 1823. Now Age of Reason is the one where Thomas Paine has knocked down Christianity and showed the shady side of Christianity, and also talks in the rights of man as which are rights which are natural rights, inborn rights, not given by anybody to anybody. These were read also and what is most important, that finally in cultural roots, Dadoba Pandurang writes that becomes a basis of Paramahotsabha is Dharma Vivechan. He, as just now, Ushaben was saying, it is Western society is rights bound, Indian society is duty bound. Once everybody does their duty, one need not have to fight for rights. That is why it's duty bound. And dharma is in that sense, dharma is always used. Raja dharma, Vyavhar dharma, as a dharma, as a father, as a husband, like this. Every social life is regulated by dharma, not the religion. It is dharma is a way of life, and that's what is being the basis. If Phule reads Thomas Paine and Theodore Parker, it is not Abraham Lincoln who said democracy is for the people, of the people, and by the people. It was Theodore Parker who first said. It was conveyed to Abraham Lincoln by William Hendon, and Abraham Lincoln used it in Gettysburg speech, and that's how it is attributed to Abraham Lincoln. Now these were read by persons like Phule and in Prarthana Samaj, but basis of which this comes back in Phule is is what he published later on, Jati Bhed Vivek Sar of Tukaram Tatya Padwar, and which is based on a Sanskrit text that talks of Buddhist idea of Samatha, Vajrashuchi. And recently, my friend from Calcutta was asking me about how Vajrashuchi, and there is also Rajaram Mohan Roy translating Vajrashuchi, has now recently been found. So these are the people go back to the roots. People go back to the roots, and that is exactly a thing that became in social reform, as well as historical consciousness. It's a historical consciousness, and you see, Tilak starting his Shivaji Utsav was much later a thing. The first reaction that came on the question of Maratha state came when Grand Duff wrote a history of Marathas in 3 volumes. And the third volume came up in 1863. And it was Ranede's instructions on which, because in the introduction only, Nilkant Janardhan Kirtane writes, I am writing this at the instance of Mahadev Govind Ranade. Ranade was quite young at that time, had just cleared his graduation when the third edition came. And in the third edition, there are 18 pages what Mountstuart Elphinstone wrote and gave advice to Grand Duff, saying that be careful about the gasconading buckers and the gossiping tawariks. So he writes. But reaction to that came from Nilkant Janardhan Kirtane. But that Kirtane's book on reaction, say comments on this Grand Duff's work, produced 2 different strands in Maharashtrian amongst the intellectuals. One was of Ranade and others. Ranade later on wrote 6 articles in Asiatic Society Journal when he became as a High Court judge here between 1893 and 99. They were collected together with an introduction, and in 1900 published as The Rise of Maratha Power. They were already published in Asiatic Society journals. And Ranade was vice president of Asiatic Society, of what is now in Asiatic Society of Mumbai. Now, Ranede's idea of writing history of Maratha power had 2 reasons. He was reacting to the British, because they were all the time with the national movement and everything, say Indian National Congress being started in 1885. Many British administrators and Secretary of State Islington and others, they said, hey, you first better know your society. You do not know anything about administration. You have no experience of administration. And to counter that argument, here was Ranade wrote Rise of Maratha Power to show how there was an administration, how the idea of that administration was how the idea of a Swaraj was created by the saint poets of Maharashtra, how there was a mint to have their own currency. So having a currency is the biggest denominator of sovereignty. And therefore currency, he wrote those articles in, and they were collected and wrote in Rise of Maratha Power in 1900. But the second strand was very powerful, and that was of Vishnu Shastri Chiplankar. Chiplankar, between, earlier there was Lokhitwadi who published in 1848 and 50 Shatapatre, they are 118, but indicting in the ills of Indian Hindu society. Now they say with Chiplankar and his Nibandhamala, he wrote a 75-page article called Itihas. He condemned colonial historiography of James Mill, of number of others who showed that Indians were incapable of any administration or do not know how to govern themselves, and were biased against Indians. So his reaction in that, in Nibanmala, produced a different genre. different. And then he started along with Ken Sane, Kashinath Narayan Sane, and with another friend of his, he started Kavetiya Sangrahalaya. Mind you, 25 bakhars he published in that, in a period of 11 years, and more than 5,500 pages of Maratha documents were published between 1874 and 1889. So 11 to 12 years of existence of that, and that created a different patriotism, nationalist feeling, and it is to that Chiplunker school that Tilak belongs. It is to that Tilak belongs. And now, what is the outcome of this kind of thing? If you see all the newspapers of the earlier period, Sammot Kamudi in Bengal. Now, say Bengal Darpan, Harkaru, Bengal Darpan, Mirror. Similarly, Bombay Darpan, Subodh Patrika, Prarthana Samaj started. They started Indu Prakash. It's the light that is coming from where? Our light that is coming from. It's knowledge coming from. Now no more. Now no more. Now they say it's Kesari, the lion. See, the Kesari, the Maratha. The Maratha is not, it is not a territorial, it's a territorial denominator. It's not a caste denominator. In 19th century, you will find everybody was used a Maratha Brahman, a Maratha, say, Kunbi, a Maratha, even a Dakkani Muslim. It is not, so it is a Maratha is not a caste denominator. That comes much later after 1920, Maratha as a caste. And today it has become so powerful, least spoken the better. But that particular time it was primarily territorial denominator. That the Maratha, like the earlier Shivaji's time, we will fight back. And why Shivaji is? Because Shivaji was acceptable, his administration contained everyone. It did not accept just the nobility, Maratha nobility, Shanokuli. It had its Brahmins as ministers, and they all fought wars, including Maramoshis, Kolis, and every section of the society fought for Maratha state. So something, a kind of a nation idea of a nation, because the very concept of nation in Europe and in that came to India is late 18th century. So the idea, something akin to nation, that's what Elphinstone said, was created by Shivaji. And it is this particular Maratha that becomes the title of his newspaper, the Maratha, the Kesari, the lion. We are not going to listen to everything, we are going to hit back like a lion. And that becomes, or you have in 1894 comes Shivram Mahadev Paranjape, who comes in the same line as Kala. Today you have a newspaper like Time magazine, but he started Kala, that was exactly time. It was he who first used the word called Lokmanya for Lokmanya Tilak, differentiating between what is Lokmanya and what is Rajamanya. In Marathi, everybody writes Ra Sri Ganachari. What is Ra? Rao Sahib, Rajashri Rao Sahib, Rao Bahadur. This is the format it was. But these are the say accolades given by the state in recognition. So something what is state recognized, the British colonial state recognized, and what is recognized by the people, the first person to use Lokmanya was Shivram Mahadev Paranjape. Now, if you see the words and the history becomes one of the most important factor. Shivaji, why they started Shivaji Utsav? Tilak started, it was because Shivaji was acceptable to all cross sections of society. All cross sections of society. It be Kunbi, it be Dalits, every one of them. But then why Ganpati? Ganeshotsav. There are so many articles written on Ganeshotsav by say in Kesari. Normally it should have been. These are like symbols. These are symbols. It is not Ganapati as a god, but 11 days you get a platform to give your mobilize your nationalist ideas. 11 days at every nook and corner you have a platform, right? And that's what Ganesh so provided. Now Ganesh, it should have been Dasra, but Dasra, because you take all those weapons, Pandavas came out incognito, incognito. They came and took the weapons and fought against evil. But that was only one day, one evening. Ganesh Utsav provided 11 days of that. And that is exactly where, and the importance of that, I tell you, is the CID records till 1893 are only 200 pages. Suddenly in 1894, they become much more than 600 pages. That exactly shows what impact this particular had. And I must also say, because people do not know about it was not just against the Muslims that Ganesh Utsav or anybody started. It was making a mass mobilization of patriotic conscience. It was not just in most of the political and issues after the revolt of 1857. I need not, because of want of time. They came. The things provided a retreat from earlier universalism to particularism. Arya Samaj, back to Vedas. Vivekananda movement, Vedanta. It is not retreat, it is getting to the roots. And it is Tilak. Tilak met Vivekananda in Bombay to Pune railway. And he took him to his place, house. He arranged, at that time he was more known as Narendra Datta. This was in 1893, before going to Chicago conference. And Tilak, he arranged 3 lectures of Vivekananda. And he kept, and that Tilak on Vivekananda was my first paper in life, right? Which I wrote in 1983. So Tilak was this one. What Tilak used Gita Rahasya is something to bring it into our own consciousness again. Our own rooted in this one. It was, he talks of Karma Yoga. He doesn't talk of Bhakti and other things. He is Karma Yoga. Do your duty first. And it is this particular aspect. And mind you, there are 36, I have counted it in Gita Rahasya written by him. I have counted, he has referred 36 thinkers of West and given them in footnoted them, including Radhakrishnan, right? And he has interpreted it as Karma Yoga. It is an action. Now, Gita was first translated into English by Edwin Arnold, called the Song Celestial. Edwin Arnold had become in 1865, when it became Pune Sanskrit College into Deccan College, it became in 1865. He was the first principal of Deccan College, Edwin Arnold. He was actually teaching in Oxford. He was brought over here. Now, he called it the Song Celestial. Now, if you see on 1818 Sedition Committee report, it has mentioned Bhagavad Gita as the textbook for mental training of revolutionary recruits. Now, it's a journey from Song Celestial to this. Anybody, one of the most famous person in Marathi poetry is Keshav Sud. Keshav Sud's father, Krishnaji Keshav Krishnaji Damle, he wrote Ekashloki Gita. And for writing Ekashloki Gita, he was sent to jail for 1 year. They were all close to Tilakite thinking. And remember, it is not just in Maharashtra. Same thing you find, similar thing in Bengal, Anandamath comes of Bankim Chandra Chatterjee's. Now, the heat was against, written in the background of what the Nawab's government was. So, they could not write directly against the British. So, it had to be disguised in the form of writing against this. You have the similar writings in Hindi, first coming up by Bhartendra Harishchandra. So, this particular sentiment is growing everywhere. It is not that this extremism, they were now fed up of petition and prayers. And all these people are using, in 1904, for the first time, a picture of Bharat Mata was painted by Raja Ravi Verma. There are so many CID records against Raja Ravi Verma, who had a painter's depot, and he had a workshop in Kurla, and he had some German technicians with him, and it was suspected to be bringing guns, revolvers. So Ravi Verma's name figures much prominently, but Ravi Verma brought all cultural figures of Saraswati, of Lakshmi and Bharat Mata, which becomes the basis of Bankim's Anandamath's Vande Mataram song becomes a patriotic icon. Now, this is what earlier culture, that's what Barzun was talking, where symbols are being used to have different meanings, cultural meanings. Symbols are being used, and from that particular, I'm just abruptly speaking about it because for want of time. But you have Tilak using all this, and then only once he contested election, only once, and it came in debate in 1897, and he resigned. He was member of the Harris's government executive council, elected member, and when he was sentenced to 2 years of imprisonment in 1897. It was actually on the article was written by Khadilkar, and it was published in Maratha newspaper, and there was a poem given, Shivajiche Udgar, and beneath that it was a shield and two swords like this. This was interpreted as making an appeal for armed revolution, and Tilak was sentenced to. And he said, how can such a person be a member of the executive council? Tilak thereafter never contested. Gandhi never contested. Right? I want to tell you that Tilak is different every imprisonment. But Tilak had great confidence in European jurisprudence, British jurisprudence, English jurisprudence. And therefore, he always felt that he would get justice in law. This one, they use law as an instrument of coercion. They are actually in 1882, Tilak and Agarkar apologized, yet they were sent to jail. In 1897, Tilak was sent to jail as an editor. He accepted as editor the responsibility. Then in 1907, the CID, there is a report. There are few articles coming from the pen of Khadilkar. The CID say, the secretary writes, there are few articles coming from the pen of Khadilkar, and we can send Tilak out of the country. The decision to send him out of the country was first taken. Then the judge was changed. In 1897, junior judge was brought on board called Justice Strachey. And Strachey gave that law of sedition 124A, the meaning is like this. The meaning ought to be like this. And I am giving judgment what ought to be. He first gives judgment on what ought to be and then writes to the government, make an amendment to that effect. It was travesty of judiciary. It was travesty of judiciary. Huh? That and the entire nation for the first time, who arranged for Tilak's defense? The editors, Shishir Kumar Ghosh and his brother, the editors of Amrut Bazar Patrika. They sent the all lawyers. Now, for the first time in Indian history, the front page was left blank, and the only caption was the Strachey law. Now, every time in 1907, he owned the articles because they were there. Later on, Khadilkar also wrote, those articles were written by me. He has mentioned it in his autobiography. But Tilak owned them as editor. Now, this, the 1916, Jinnah appeared for him, Tilak. Now, he changes the technique. First, the Britishers would say, judges would say, hey, you committed sedition. So, the onus of proving that I did not commit sedition was on the defendant. Was not. There was not, the plaintiff had not to argue anything. He had only to charge. It is the defendant who had to prove that he has not committed sedition. This technique continued till he came back from Mandalay. And then Jinnah turned the whole car upside down. And he said, define this. Define this. Who is bureaucracy? His bureaucracy means British. The judge, Batchelor, got very wild. And he said, do you know, asked Jinnah, do you know before whom you are arguing? Jinnah said, no. He said, but your lordship only knows that he is listening to country's best lawyer. But he got him. And the CID say that 6 persons, there were 7 garlands, 11 people, all those 7 people, same garland, put them on Tilak, and Tilak went and put it on Jinnah. But this whole thing is also written in the memoirs which I have found out in the archives of Horniman, which took Horniman. Now, this is, Gandhi had knowledge of this. What happened to Tilak? Gandhi had knowledge. I'll take only 5 minutes and this one. Gandhi had the knowledge of what had happened to Tilak. Now, mind you, Gita Rahasya and everything is rooted in cultural symbols of this country. Now, Gandhi first comes to India, he meets Gokhale at Calcutta. Gokhale at Calcutta. And it's a funny, very funny incident. He kept Gandhi waiting. He says, let me first finish the billiards game and then meet you. I never ever could imagine that Gokhale used to play billiards. And even in 1885, there is when I was going through the records of Deccan Education Society, tomorrow's meeting I would not be able to attend because I have a cricket match to play with the European club. So Gokhale used to. Now here is a different thing. I always felt, why should Gandhi call him as the mentor, political mentor? He was agnostic, literally bordering on atheism, Gokhale. At least Agarkar had a Shendi, he did not have that also. And his own guru, Ranade, was a devout Hindu. But when he was telling, Ranade defined, and which was used by Gokhale in his conversation with Gandhi, he says faith, and Ranade defined it beautifully. Faith is different and blind faith is different. Some people argue faith means blind faith. No. He said, and it is in that context, Gandhi's faith is in Satya is reason faith. What is faith? It is reasoned faith, reasoned belief. Andhashraddha or blind faith is unreasoned belief. Unreasoned. And Ranade was a devout, and yet it is Gokhale, who asked him to have an all India tour. That changed the life. Now, bring back to symbols again. Come back. Apart from Satyagraha, the word, it was coined in South Africa. He changes his European dress. He comes to Indian dress on which, and he deliberately uses it. I mean, it is not by default, it is by deliberate action, design he used it. And when he met the Queen at the timetable, say, roundtable conference, he told her on her face, when she said, there have been raving reports about the naked fakir in the press. He said, yes, I have at least this much. My countrymen do not have even this much under your Majesty's benevolent government. He could do that. It is, where does Ranade or this Gokhale and Gandhi, on what platform they come together? It's the concept of truth. That's exactly why he called him as mentor, my political mentor, his concept of truth. In Welby Commission, before Welby Commission, when Gokhale gave testimony before Welby Commission, he talked about the atrocities committed during plague and the evidence, he says, is forthcoming, and as soon as I get it, I will lay it before you. But the evidence did not come. The members of the Welby Commission told Gokhale, you need not have to apologize. He says, no, I am not apologizing for anybody. I am apologizing for myself. How could I make a statement without evidence? And this is what was transparency in truth. And that's where Gokhale and Gandhi came on the same platform. It is their belief in court. And as I said, Gandhi knew what had happened to Tilak. So he first condemns this violence. Because what Tilak was earlier saying in his articles, that your repression is, the more you repress, the more reaction will come. So too much of repression breeds revolution. That was the adage he was trying to tell. He was not justifying violence, but he was cautioning the government. Now this was interpreted by the British as lending justification for violence. For Muzaffar bomb case. Now, what Gandhi changes the technique. The first thing he does, whether in South Africa or here, is saying that I am guilty. And then he tells them that your law is hollow. So he exposes the oppressive law. Now, what in 1907 in Tilak? Now, again, I would like to tell you one terminology, extremists and moderates, who first used it, the British. And Tilak keeps writing, extremism does not mean non-belief in constitution. It is belief in constitution, one which is provided by you under the Act of 1909. So, we don't believe in that. But we are legal. Swadeshi is legal. So, there is a difference between what is legal and what is morally right. There is a difference. So, what the British believed, they gave a coercive constitution and said, if anybody does not believe in that, then you are extremist. It's a very different thing what he wrote, and those articles and I went through those files of Kesari, and they all bear all the chappas, Exhibit 137, Exhibit 138, all these files of Bombay archives were taken to London for Chirol case. And that's where, so Gandhi knew what had happened to Tilak, and therefore first condemns violence, which the British had never imagined. He first started with most remote area of Champaran, then comes to Kheda, and then against our own people, Ahmedabad. So he sets the agenda. Tilak worked within British agenda of justice. Gandhi does not do it. Gandhi sets his agenda and makes the British work in it. They cannot fathom him. Where is he going to start the satyagraha next? On what principle is he going to start next? I mean, they could never ever imagine that somebody. No, he goes to the first national leader who goes and listens to the indigo planters and peasants. First thing he tells there, I have not come here to lecture you. I have come here to listen to you. 8 days quietly sat and only listened to their pain. And he said, I have come to listen to your pain. That's exactly what brought the people. Somebody has come to listen to our pain. You know, he did not wave a magic wand, no. But people believed in his sincerity. And Gandhi is he rightly called experiments with truth because he is changing. Tilak was changing in one era. Tilak in the last years wrote 4 articles, letters which I have, in which he asks his own followers to become Gandhians. You take Baptista, you take Khadilkar, you take a number of those, almost all of them, including Senapati Bapat, every one of them has become Gandhian, except one who called himself Tilkite, never went to jail, N.C. Kalkar. All of them have become Gandhian, Javadekar. And there has been a wrong reportage done today that Maharashtra did not accept Gandhian. The best Gandhians have come from Maharashtra, including Vinoba Bhave. Acharya Javadekar was one of the, on which my friend Ashok Chausalkar has written a beautiful monograph, Samajwadi Gandhism. So it is projected. Some also are talking about another thing is Gandhi favored Nehru. The mode of agitation, the strategy. You see, you change the dress. The dress is most important. Although he himself did not wear cap, all Nehru and others, you could not expect the same thing to happen, and he did not accept. Jinnah did not accept to change. Jinnah never ever lived every day without a 3-piece suit. His role model was Gokhale talking in this, but Gokhale never wore a tie and suit. Tilak, when they went to England, wore those achkans, which are Indian in tradition. Gokhale had his pagdi, even in England. Tilak had his pagdi, even in England. Now here, that we are like this, and it is all this becomes symbolism. You know, these symbols, how they are appropriated. Satyagraha, the very concept is Indian. If you read his dialogues with Raichand Mehta, who said, you need not have to become a Jain, but the trace of all Satyagraha comes from Jain Anekavad philosophy. So how it is here, the cultural symbols, cultural norms are used, and Gandhi interprets his own. Gandhi does not differs. He says, I am not going to believe in Shatam Pratyapi Shatam. He writes to Tilak, I am going to use Shatam Pratyapi Satyam. No matter whatever he might do, I will only use Satya. And it is here, Gandhi is all the time changing. Every Satyagraha is an advancement over the earlier Satyagraha. He first sees its efficacy, sees how far it becomes successful, then goes from non-cooperation, from civil to, when non-cooperation, I am not going to cooperate the evil civil law. But in civil disobedience, he goes ahead and says, I am going to break the evil civil law. The state. If Tilak raised a question, am I committing Rajadroha or is the state committing Deshadroha? I think the sentence is all eternal should be used even today. And Gandhi raises a further question to this. Is the evil law of the state higher than the moral law of my moral conscience? Which is higher? And I am going to follow my law of my conscience. And that's exactly what he told the Justice Kennedy in Ahmedabad, with banker along with him. Here they are using, and that's where the British could not know. And one on which I have written a full paper, and I am now thinking of writing a full book, is how theatre, proscribed Marathi theatre, worked from 1860 to 1926. 1926. What Gandhi's greatest essay, Tilak's resistance was to the colonial state, and by his own action. When press and everything was gagged, it's the theatre that becomes the most mobilizing force. You see, mobilizing force. And then in the margin, the governor writes, Nandi is addressed to Vishnu, please ascertain whether Tilak is compared to Vishnu. That's what is in the Nandi, it is margin, governor writes. Here, even in this, you see, it is this particular theatre and how culture was used, and therefore I come to my first statement which I made, is that the Indian intellectuals thought it was not just a political and economic conquest, it was a cultural conquest, and it had to be countered within our cultural roots. And that's exactly this is what I am formulating. Please accept it as work in progress. And if you have any questions to ask, I will be very delighted, because that will clarify my own doubts. Thank you very much. And I am very grateful to the Usha Ben and Yogesh Bhai to have given me an opportunity to speak on what I now consider the cultural response, and titling my coming book as Cultural Encounters, Essays in Intellectual History. Thank you very much. Thank you so much.